And welcome to the Agronomists, everybody. I'm your host, Sean Haney. Thanks a lot for joining us here tonight. The hockey game's a blowout, so you got no excuses. You should be here learning tonight from our panel. Really, really looking forward to tonight's show. It's going to be a lot of fun. Remember, if you want to qualify for CCA credits tomorrow, go to realagriculture.com/agronomists and you can be sure to collect those credits for watching here tonight. The other thing you could do while you're there is sign up for our agronomist email. We notify you of this show, and in the morning we say, hey, we're ready to go with the credits as well. So that's a great, I would say, or I would advise you to do that because we always forget to do those kinds of things, and it's hard to get CCA credits this year. So go to realagriculture.com/agronomist to get the full benefit of the show. One of the beauties of these live streams, you get to participate, you join in the fun, you make comments, you ask questions with our experts. That is always one of the best parts of this show. All you have to do is basically enter your comment, your question in the comment box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or Twitch. And we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Tonight's topic, it's an important one. It's interpreting your soil test results. Now, some of you are soil testing every year. Some of you are doing it every 3 to 4 years, whatever. We're going to talk tonight about interpreting those results, making the right fertility choice. Fertilizer is expensive, and how you interpret those results can have a big impact on how good of a decision you are making. That's about the extent of my knowledge. Our panel tonight, they are experts in this field. Let's start off first. Let's actually bring them both in here. Let's start off first on the far right. It is John Hurd of Manitoba Agriculture. Hey, John, how are you?
We're good out here. I'm glad to see those Canadians laying a licking on the Russians today.
They did. The game, I haven't. It was 4-0 at the beginning of the third period. So good to see. Good to see. Hopefully, I would like to see a Canada-U.S. final. I think that would be pretty cool and give us something definitely to cheer for. Also joining us tonight out of, do I get this right, out of Plimpton, Wyoming, Ontario, it is Ryan Benjamins of Benjamin's Agronomy. Hey, Ryan, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here tonight on with both the Sean and John show.
Well, you know what? I'm looking forward to this because we're going to learn a lot here. I've also got some clips, as we always do, on the Agronomists. We're going to get to those in a second. John, I want to start with you talking about, the importance of the soil test. Obviously, we can't interpret results if we don't have the test. How often should somebody be soil testing?
Well, it depends on a lot of things. But you alluded to the importance of it. In Manitoba alone, a small province, we spend $600 to $700 million a year on fertilizer. So it's a major decision. And it basically gives you an inventory of where to start and what's achievable. And we're just a few days into the new year. A lot of very important fertility decisions were made the last couple of weeks. So some people could buy before year end if they haven't purchased fertilizer already. But we are that time of year when the agronomist has to meet with the farmers and go over their soil test and explain, what things mean and have that conversation. I say that it's not a black and white decision. It's a conversation that you have with the grower in order to come up with a reasonable fertility plan.
Yeah, and Ryan, you've got farmer customers. You're doing this consulting yourself, along with a lot of the audience here as well. What do you tell your clients in terms of how often they should be soil testing?
Yeah, I'm typically in that 3 to 4 year range. So not every year by any means. And I guess it depends on the rotation that producers are in. If they're strictly in a corn, soybeans, wheat rotation, then it's certainly after winter wheat is a great time to get that sampling done. There's some producers that are, they may do some more corn on corn or corn soybean alternation. And in the corn soybean alternation, then it's usually just skipping one alternation. So you would end up with a 4-year cycle on soil samples.
Yeah, and And John, there was some data. No, that was the
Well,
Stratus. That was the
well,
Stratus
well,
Ag.
well, before we talk about the data,
Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
gave you a politician's answer to the last question. I didn't answer that. Out in the West, where we test for nitrogen, it's a every year proposition because soil nitrogen does change so much from year to year, weather, cropping yields, and things like that. So if it's nitrogen, it's an annual soil testing that really needs to be done in order to track nitrogen. P and K, micronutrients, other things in the soil that might be interesting, they don't change that much. But the reality is, when you hire someone like Ryan to come to the field and do the testing, uh, getting a full analysis done is a minor expense. I don't know anyone that just goes and measures nitrogen alone. Most will get a full analysis done. The analytical cost of getting it done is actually pretty minor, especially if you're getting a professional to do your soil sampling. That's where you're spending your money.
And John, 6 to 12. What are the depths that sorry, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 24?
Okay. Yeah, yeah. When Moses came down from the mountain, it was 0 to 6 and 6 to 24. Okay.
Yeah.
0 to 6 for the immobile nutrients, P and K, and organic matter, micronutrients, and 0 to 6 and 6 to 24 for nitrate, nitrogen, sulfur, maybe chloride, and salts. So, but since then, people have made compromises on that. But it's great now that we've got a group of professional soil sampling people with good equipment. There's really no excuse for not doing the 24-inch samples.
Okay.
We put these probes in the truck. So there's not an excuse out here for not sampling to proper depths.
Ryan, same depths or same recommendations out east?
Somewhat different, I would say. Well, just the mindset of sampling mobile nutrients, I should say, isn't as common. There is what we call our PSNT, so pre-sidrous nitrate test that we do occasionally in corn, but otherwise we're just sampling that 6-inch depth for our macronutrients like phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, all those sort of elements. We're just sampling that 6-inch depth, and then when we're doing nitrate or sulfate, sulfur, we are going to the 12-inch depth. But no, we're certainly not doing a lot of that deeper sampling here in Ontario.
And what's the reason for that again?
I would think go ahead, John. You want to answer that one?
Well, I was just going to say that you don't drive over the fields with your 4x4 pickup truck with your core mounted between you and your partner. These hydraulic probes can punch through light frost and can do sampling to 24 inches. You're not set up for that in Ontario. When I was down there, I beat myself up using Dutch augers and things like this. And you've got too many stones in parts of Ontario. So I don't know that I've seen very many people sample to 2 feet.
Yeah. Well, Peter Johnson's watching, and he just made the comment, I could never get 24 inches deep with my stones. So, yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay, what I want to do is I'm going to pull up the first clip, and I've got 3 I want to get to tonight, so I want to make sure I work them in. The first one I want to show is Ross McKenzie. It's an interview I did with him about a year ago right here in the Real Ag studio here in Lethbridge. Ross is retired Alberta agriculture a research agronomist. And we talked about what should we be testing for, and then we can discuss. Here is Ross McKenzie. what do we need to be testing for? Of course, MP and K come right to mind, but does it stop there?
Yeah, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur are really the big ones. But you also want to do occasionally, if you don't have micronutrient problems, maybe test for micronutrients once every 5 years. If you do have problems with micronutrients, like for example copper in central Alberta on the black or gray soils or transition soils, you might want to be checking for that every year. So micronutrients are important, but we don't have widespread micronutrient problems, but it's something you want to keep an eye on all the time. But micronutrients are often over-promoted, but if you test, at least you know where you're at and then get a couple of opinions from a couple of different agronomists if you do have a recommendation for it. The other thing that I like to see farmers test for is simply soil pH. pH can change very dramatically across. One of our sites is south of Lethbridge where we did variable rate fertilizer. We had 16 different benchmarks, and soil pH ranged from 5.3 to 7.8, depending on where you were on the slope position. So pH can change quite dramatically with topography, and so that's something you want to keep an eye on. But is your soil pH slowly dropping? As we're using nitrogen and sulfur fertilizers over the years, they are acidifying, and your soil pH will slowly drop. And if you're using no-till, where you're not mixing the top couple of inches of soil with the rest of your topsoil, then that pH can start to drop fairly significantly, which can then have a negative effect on nitrogen-fixing bacteria with our legume crops, like our pulse crops. So that's something to keep an eye on. Particularly in the southern prairies, we do have some problems with soil salinity, so doing a test called electrical conductivity, or EC, is always wise. And if you're in certain levels, if you're below 1, you're fine, but once you creep up to 3 or 4, you can start losing 20 to 40% of your yield potential, depending on the crop. And if you're up to 5 or 6 or 7, you lose significant yield potential, but you still don't see any weight on the fields. So that's what I call hidden salinity, but the soil test will show that up. And even things like soil organic matter, that's organic carbon people are very concerned about, and you can have the lab do that too. Most labs don't use a really precise test, but they'll at least give you an indication, or are you 2%, 4%, or 6%, which is nice to know.
And when you do get all those recommendations, those numbers, those results back, then you got to kind of make a decision what you're going to do with it.
And actually, just before we talk about that, I should mention that you also want to make sure the lab you send your samples to are going to be doing the right analyses. So, for example, with phosphorus, different labs use different methods. In Manitoba, the recommended method is the Olsen method, or sodium bicarbonate method. That's what they've done all their calibrations for, and that's what they recommend. In Alberta, in the early 90s, we looked at a number of different soil tests for phosphorus. We identified the modified Kelowna method as the one that gave us the best accuracy, and that's the one that we would recommend. And so the recommendations we have now for phosphorus, not only would we make a recommendation, we can also give you a probability of response. Is it a 90 or a 70 or a 40% probability of response based on the research we did? But if the lab doesn't use, it's a lab you send your samples to, doesn't use a modified Kelowna method, if they use the Bray or the Olsen, you're going to get a much less accurate recommendation. So that's not acceptable in my opinion. So always make sure the lab is using the analyses that are recommended for Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba.
A very, very good point. And can you ask a lab specifically, hey, what method are you using, and here's what I'd like you to use?
And hopefully they will report the methods on their soil test report. And if you're from Alberta and you see it was the Olsen or the Bray method used, well, you might want to say, well, in the future I want the modified Kelowna. Most labs will make that adjustment.
What could be the difference in the results between the methods?
Huge, actually. For example, the Bray method is a strong acid extractant, and it was designed by Bray and Kurtz back in 1945 for acid soils, and it worked fine on acid soils. But if your pH range of your soil ranges from 5.5 to 7.5, well, it might work better at the lower pHs, but not better at the higher pHs. As a matter of fact, it performs very poorly once you're about 7.0, like pH of 7. But the Olsen method, that method is they use sodium bicarbonate. They buffer to a pH, the extractants buffer to a pH of 8.5, and it works reasonably well. Actually, works quite well on high pH soils above 7. But if you start using it at a pH of 6 or 5.5, all the work that Olsen did back in that method was developed back in about 1954, and it was designed for high pH soil. So, but if you use the modified Kelowna, and that's one reason why I like it, it's a weak acid extractant, highly buffered, so it's not really affected by soil pH.
Oh,
So it really becomes very important to make sure you're using the right methods.
I promise you, there's a lot of people listening and watching this. They're like, I did not know that. I promise you that for sure.
And to be honest, there's a lot of agronomists that don't even know that, and that's so. There's a lot of things that we really want to make sure we do. If we do all those things well, you're going to get huge value from your soil test.
Great stuff. We're going to unpack that. Ryan, what method is most common in Ontario? Do you know in terms of which soil test method?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Sean?
I can hear you. Your screen froze. Just go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the most common ways of extracting nutrients for phosphorus would be the Olsen, so sodium bicarbonate, and potassium would be ammonium acetate.
Okay. John, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, that's the same way in Manitoba. They embraced or adopted using the Olsen sodium bicarb, and but we fit the bill precisely for that. Like a lot of the northern Great Plains states, we tend to have calcareous soils, and those higher pH soils are the ones where the Olsen's most appropriate. But I'm glad you've got Ryan there from Ontario, because we go back to one of my old soil professors at Guelph, Tom Bates at Guelph. He used to have these batches of soils that they had done phosphorus uptake measures on. And every time some chemist came out of the closet with a new extractant, he could test it on it and see if it's as good as. And it invariably showed that the Olsen actually worked pretty good across a range of pHs. And that's why it was really found appropriate for Ontario. And so that's why I'd consider it a pretty good fit out west here also.
Okay, so I get the results. So I've decided what I'm going to test for, and I've got the results. Now what do I do, John? That's I think let's get to that.
Well, here you go to not many, but we all have these books.
Yeah.
I don't know how to hold that. Books with charts in it. Now, they could be sexed up, and most people now sex them up by making an app. I see that in Ontario, they've done nothing different than take their charts and they've sexed it up with an app now that it looks like Ontario Soil and Crop funded. And so people can go and input their values, and the app will do the conversions for them based, I presume, on some type of yield potential and other things. But there's more that goes into a phosphorus recommendation than a chart or an app. There's a lot of questions as far as what's the land tenure, what's the financial situation, are crop prices really high and phosphorus prices low? That to me is a signal. It's an opportunity to do some batch applications and maybe replenish soils. So there's a lot of other factors that aren't in the dirty old charts that we have as far as coming up with a rate.
I like that you sex them up. I didn't know that you could sex up soil test results. I like that. I've learned from you tonight. I like that. That's pretty good. Yeah. Ryan, do you then look at P and K first from your perspective out east, or do you start with pH or CC, percent of organic matter? How do you kind of dive into the results?
Yeah, so if I'm looking at a field that is completely strange to me, I've never been on it, I did not do the sampling myself, then I would probably start by looking at obviously pH. Without proper pH, there's a lot of nutrient availability issues that can arise. So that's kind of a starting point. There's no sense just looking at phosphorus and saying, okay, I need to pour a whole bunch of phosphorus out here when my pH is extremely low, right? So it's targeting that number one issue first. And then the other thing I would look at, would be CEC. And CEC is a measurement. It combines both clay content, with clay being negatively charged, and then all your positive ions being cations, the calcium, potassium, magnesium, etc. Those bind to those sites. So the CEC is a combination of I guess clay content and percent organic matter. So it's the gives you a bit of nature of what type of soil you are dealing with. Is it a type of soil like really low CEC would be like usually a sand soil, usually less than 10, and heavy clays are usually above 20, right? So it gives you an idea of how easy is it to build those levels. Is it a type of farm that can hold nutrients that you could fertilize, say, for 3 years? Or is it a farm that you need to apply fertilizer in smaller amounts more regularly?
Hey, John, I pulled up a slide here. Does this kind of, am I on the right slide then for this point in the discussion?
Well, sure. I think that fits. I'm really glad to hear Ryan talk about it that way, because invariably when a farmer looks at a soil test, he's looking at, okay, how much money is this going to cost me? He's looking at the fertilizer recommendations. And that, to me, that's the last part to look at. First, you should look at what are the soil properties or what determines yield potential. And that's what Ryan went over. Soil pH, cation exchange capacity, which is important, also gives an indication of water holding capacity, maybe organic matter. But the big kicker out west here is salinity. There's no use fertilizing for full yield potential if you're dealing with salts that are going to put a lid on yields. So I really like to look first at the soil properties that affect soil productivity before we even start thinking about fertilizer. And so we're the same as Ontario, only they don't deal with salts the same way that we do out west.
Lucky them.
Yeah, their salts are all get washed out through, they get more rainfall than we do, takes it away.
Yeah. Okay. I got a couple questions here from the audience. Jenneth wants to know, John, how many acres across Western Canada reported are deficient on phosphate? And then Ryan, she wants to know the same thing for Ontario. So, John.
Okay. Well, first, Jenneth, I hope you read your email today. I'm coming fishing near Lac de Bonnie tomorrow, and so you're going to put that oat sample out by the shop for me to pick up. Okay. Now, the answer to your question, Janet, I don't have the acres, but I did look at a nice presentation that one of my past colleagues from Alberta put together, and it looks like we have in the prairies, about a third of our acres test below 10 part per million phosphorus, which would be, we consider deficient or low. About a third or so fit in the sweet spot. I'd call a good working range between 10 to 20 parts per million. And then we tend to have the rest testing more than that. Now, the thing on our environmental regulations somewhat change the soil testing that's done, because soil testing is required in order to know how much or where you can put manure. People that do consult with livestock growers tend to take a lot of soil samples, and some of those tend to be on high testing fields. So that's why we tend to have a third of our samples being on high testing fields. It probably really taints the general perspective. And for a lot of people that have low phosphorus levels, they're the ones that aren't soil testing to begin with.
Yeah. And Ryan, I know that you've got a lot of livestock clients, so you're paying attention to the phos levels out there for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So to answer that question, I wouldn't have exact figures what it would be across all of Ontario. I do somewhat recall one of the labs in Ontario sharing that sort of data, and I think it's, if I recall correctly, it'd be similar to what John has mentioned, about a third, a third, a third. And that will really vary depending on where you are in the province. So you get areas like in Perth County or Oxford County that are certainly more livestock. Yeah, you're going to see a higher percentage of your tests being certainly in that high range. But from what I see, even though I deal with a lot of livestock clients, I would say they're also growing their land base, and other than the home farms, which are from kind of really historic high levels, we go back, say, 30 years where most of the manure for that farm went on just that farm. We were dealing with smaller equipment, smaller manure spreaders. We didn't have, we weren't loading dry manure spreaders with payloaders or excavators and hauling it 10 kilometers down the road. So certainly now I would say there's a lot of
use, but if it's not, we heard it from Ross McKenzie there, where they've evaluated these, some of them are found lacking, and just because if it's a convenient test doesn't mean it's the right test.
Yeah.
The right test should be based on some type of running the criteria on soils in that geographical area. So although there's a lot of people would love to run the Malik 3 out west, they better put their ducks in a row and plan investing in doing some basic research to show it's appropriate before they'll get any kind of endorsement.
Good stuff. Okay, we're going to watch our second clip, and it is with one of my favorites, Regis Karamanos, talking about evaluating macros. Regis is, he's a legend in the fertilizer world. I used to enjoy running into him at airports, and haven't been doing a lot of that since last March. But we're going to play this clip. It is from a canola school episode, and here is Regis Karamanos. There we go.
Regis, when we get the soil sample results back, going through the main macronutrients, what kind of numbers we should be looking at? Okay. Let's talk about nitrogen. What should the end number say?
One thing to keep in mind with nitrogen, when we're talking about available nitrogen in the soil, that's the nitrate part. And what we mentioned to the people, sometimes they're trying to find out if the fertilizer they applied is there, and they cannot find it because at application time, fertilizer is still in ammonium form. So keep that in mind that when you get your soil test, that's, So now, when you look at the soil test, you got to look at the different depths, okay? And different labs will give you different options. One thing to remember, what is extremely important is that the number you have has been calibrated for local data. And most of the local data, whether, in any of the prairie provinces, based on the calibrations that were carried out here, is for the 0 to 24 inch depth. So if somebody gives you 0 to 6, most likely they'll be using a fad factor to convert it to 0 to 24 and so on and so forth. So, look for those numbers. And as far as nitrogen is concerned, of course, different crops will have different criteria, There is not one generic, thing to look for nitrogen. When it comes to phosphorus, though, there are some generic things to look. And with your, I would like to mark down if your soil test is less than 5 parts per million, and if they're using pounds per acre, will be less than 10 pounds per acre, then you have 100% probability of getting a response. If your soil test is between 5 and 10 parts per million, and I'm not, that's 10 to 20 pounds per acre, you got a 75% probability you're going to get a response. If it is between 10 and 20, you got a 50% probability, and if it's over 20, you've got a less than 25% probability of getting a response.
So 10 to 20 is considered maintenance level?
So 10 to 20 is where most of your fields should be, in essence, and that's where you get your bang for your buck as far as, your first 15, 20 pounds, plus you apply some for maintenance and you maintain those levels. Being over 20 is excellent, you know, if you can do that. One thing we have to be very careful is that our phosphorus recommendations are driven by normally how much we can place with a seed. And when it comes to crops such as canola, there is limitations to that. So consider, you know, a 60 bushel canola crop, which is something which is not unusual these days. Well, that will remove 54 pounds of P2O5. Raise your hand if you're applying that much. Not very many people, but even if you were to be applying 54 in the year where you expect to get 60, those 54 are not going to go into this year's crop. Actually, canola is one of the best utilizers of phosphorus because of the tap rooting, and the use efficiency can be 30%, 35%. Still, that is 20 pounds. So how you've been fertilizing over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it will influence what you get today, and what you fertilize today will influence what you get tomorrow. You cannot just, you know, stop fertilizing for phosphorus, okay?
So going back to the paper that you get back from the lab, the Olsen number is the one to look at in Western Canada?
The Olsen number is the bicarbonate, and as well, if you're doing with labs there are labs here in like ALS in Saskatchewan, Exova in Alberta, or Pharmazeds here in Manitoba, where they use modifications of the Kelowna test that's been calibrated, and it maybe gives 10% to 50% higher numbers, but you know, in the main, they're pretty much the same numbers for both, you know, for Olsen and Kelowna, and those have been calibrated with, you know, field experiments in Western Canada.
Okay.
So
moving then, yeah, to potassium.
So potassium, one thing to remember is that the generally accepted critical level in Western Canada based on soil, a lot of experiments, is 125 parts per million. This will be 250 pounds, which means if your soil test is less than that, you'll have a 95% probability of getting a response. How much response you're going to get will depend very much on how low it is. If it's 50 ppm, you may be getting like 1,000% yield increase, you know. But if it is 110 ppm, you may only get 10% yield increase. When it goes above that, the research actually, some of my own research that I've done, is I found that with malt barley, you know, we get some really good responses. When it comes to crops such as canola, peas, and wheat, the responses actually with, you know, we should not be looking into applying any potassium. And one thing to remember, potassium and phosphorus recommendations or, safe rates are additive. In other words, if your safe rate, say with canola for phosphorus is 30 pounds and you decide to put 10 pounds of potassium, now you got to subtract 10 pounds of phosphorus. And that will be goofy in some ways because you get a heck of a lot more big bang for your buck for phosphorus than you would get from potassium with canola.
Okay.
Okay? So that's one thing to keep. Then another thing to keep in mind is that some people suggest that you have to balance phosphorus against other nutrients such as calcium or magnesium or attain a potassium saturation that is entirely irrelevant for Western Canadian soils. It's meant for soils that are close to the equator and has no relevance to us. So don't do that, because either you over-apply potassium, or in some cases you apply and you don't have enough, you still have a deficiency. So, just don't do that. When it comes to sulfur, you should not be growing canola without sulfur. And as I mentioned, there are two critical things to remember. The soil test has large errors, probably one of the largest, the worst soil tests. I ran a soil testing lab for a few years in Saskatchewan, and I've always said, one thing you know about soil test sulfur is if it's low, you know it's low. If it's not low, you don't know what it is, because the test could be, has big error, but also the variability within a field can be so great that some areas of the field can mask the rest of the field. So just to be sure, always apply 10 pounds, it's a reasonable amount of minimum of sulfur. Another thing to remember about sulfur, there is work that was done with conventional canola cultivars, open pollinated and conventional, where there was a 7-to-1, 6-to-1 nitrogen to sulfur ratio. There was the optimum ratio that we had to adhere to. Research that was done subsequently to that with hybrid canola showed that hybrid canola can utilize sulfur at any ratio. And in those experiments, there were actually 27 in the study that I carried out. We used 1-to-1, 6-to-1, and 12-to-1 nitrogen to sulfur ratio. We couldn't separate really any particular ratio. There was a master's thesis that followed up at the University of Manitoba that showed that the rooting system of hybrid canola explores the soil volume much more efficiently. So again, make sure you apply the required nitrogen amount and the required sulfur amount. Don't worry about balancing at any given, ratio.
And we are back. I'm going to make sure I pull in. We got Ryan back too. We got his visual back. Okay, so lots to unpack there. Obviously, that is a discussion with Regis Karamanos of Koch Fertilizer from a canola perspective, but we can extrapolate that into other crops and other geographies as well. John, I'll start with you. What did you hear there that you really think we should emphasize?
Well, it was basically, he was reading out of the same songbook that we use. His categories for phosphorus fit the historic development here, that those testing below 10 part per million we consider low and probably warranting more phosphorus than removal amounts. 10 to 20 we call a good working range, where you want to apply maintenance amounts. And then if it's above 20, then you're fortunate. You've got the opportunity to meet the needs of the crop, to use starter only in years where phosphorus fertilizer is high and whatever, and you've got good flexibility. So he's talked today about using the same ranges that we use in our extension program, and that can vary somewhat based on crops, but out here seem to be similar for any work that's been done both in canola and with wheat. That's below 10 parts per million. Likelihood of response is high, and I consider if your fields are testing below 10 or below 5, those are your fixer-upper fields. Those are the ones where maybe you bought that land from Bachelor Farmer or something, and those are the ones you want to fix up by gradually applying more than you're removing, so that you can build them into a better working range.
Yeah, Ryan, it was a canola example, but let's extrapolate it into corn, beans, and winter wheat in the east. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. No, a lot of those critical levels are certainly what we would see here. I would say many agronomists in Ontario may use slightly higher number than the critical levels that were mentioned there. 20 part per million for sodium bicarbonate phosphorus, 150 for ammonium acetate on the potassium side. And part of that is just to have a little bit of leeway in terms of some variability in the sample data, right? It's just nice to know that you're not under applying because there certainly will be some variability in your sampling data. So it's somewhat crop specific. Once you get into crops like winter wheat, for example, the potassium numbers aren't quite as critical, right? But from a long-term perspective of all those crops in the rotation, those are good critical numbers to work with.
But with corn, then we start talking about things like potash that we wouldn't talk about in other crops. So, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the potassium number, the critical number, is more important in corn and soybeans than it is in winter wheat, for example. Yeah.
Hey, Ryan, I got a question here from Peter Johnson. Recent Ontario research shows more or higher yield with base fertility, 20 to 25 parts per million on P, 120 plus on K. Any comments on that?
Yeah, no, we saw some of this data presented, I want to say a couple years ago, even at Southwest Ag Conference, and certainly those are good numbers to work with. The 20 to 25, and I had mentioned the 150 instead of the 120 or 125 that was mentioned in that previous clip. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want producers moving into a real excessive high range where we get into greater environmental risk, but certainly seeing better yields where we've got, into that for sure medium range rather than approaching that deficiency.
Ryan, oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, just that we have to be we've got to dig harder for it because there isn't a lot of research that was done with this. But back in the 70s, 80s, there was some work done looking at building soils with phosphorus out west here. And where fields were built with some large batch applications of phosphorus, we actually did raise the yield potential. And that was, I think, kind of hard to swallow out here because we treated phosphorus like nitrogen, that it was an annual input. You put on enough to pay for it that year. We really didn't look at it as an investment, but now we're growing very high yield crops. We're getting some good market prices for crops, and it warrants treating phosphorus as an investment in land, not just as a 1 year at a time input. And so we have seen movement towards, some farmers looking at how can they work in these batch applications to move up their phosphorus levels to a reasonable amount so that they can move up the yield potential accordingly.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan, this may be a good time to ask your question or talk about your strip till research you've been doing.
Yeah, so I have quite a few clients now that have moved towards strip till, and one in particular, he doesn't have manure. He's almost broadcasting no fertilizer, so all the fertilizer is going in his strip till unit. So he's 30-inch corn rows and he's fall stripping. So a lot of we're talking rates of say 4 to 550 pounds of fertilizer every 2 years. And so a lot of nutrients ending up in, say, that 8-inch zone on 30-inch rows. And this past fall, I ended up doing sampling on 2 farms, and I pulled cores from between the strips. And then what I would do is I try to blend it, is my typical way of sampling. So I'd probe twice outside the zone and once in the zone. Assuming, say 10-inch strip on 30-inch, that's my average. And then I also sampled just within the strip. And this producer is been strip tilling for quite a few years, like 10 plus years. So and with almost no broadcast fertilizer, no manure. So all the nutrients going in the strip till unit. We've seen quite a spread in the levels. We've seen almost double in one field, almost double the phosphorus within the strip compared to outside the strip, from about 12 part per million on average to I think it was 25 part per million within the strip. Potassium range wasn't quite as distinct, but it was about 30 part per million higher within the strip. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of struggling now is what do we do moving forward with soybeans? Because soybeans are not grown in that strip. Do we offset our GPS and start strip tilling between the rows? Do we end up maybe broadcasting a portion of that fertilizer? And certainly environmentally, I don't think that is the way to go. John, what do you think? What would you do? And I guess how would you sample? If you were me, how would you sample these fields that are long-term strip till in the same zones year after year?
Well, I think I would do it exactly the way that you'd suggested earlier in a note. And it's not my bright idea. Dr. Fabian Fernandez at University of Minnesota, previously at University of Illinois, he studied this stuff. and found that, yeah, you take, for every soil sample you take in the strip, you take 2 or 3 in the between row areas. And then that composite is what comprises for your field measure. And I think that's just a really practical, you probably came up with that as a practical way to deal with it. And that's what his research yielded also. As far as putting those strips in the same place year after year, we don't have a lot of strip till out here in Manitoba, but I watch what they do stateside just south of us. And many of the farmers do alternate those strips. So they don't end up with this same buildup in the same strip, but by moving that soil volume around a bit, you do end up with what we call legacy bands, or permanent bands that will tend to have more phosphorus, for example, in them. My thought would be you apply enough for wheat or narrow row crops. You apply starter fertilizer to get those crops started, and then you rely upon what's in the soil for the maintenance amounts. And with those levels being built up to the levels you suggested, I think your soils are providing the maintenance amounts, but you never don't put starter phosphorus down with wheat or cereals or canola. Soybeans are a different animal. They don't seem to respond to phosphorus out here. It's soil P they need, not fertilizer P. But I think I think you're dealing with new issues there that we really don't have all the answers. I think we're counting on folks like yourself to work with growers and work up some practical solutions.
Yeah, good question, Ryan. I got a question here from Kyler. John, I'll throw it your way. What's the time frame for fertilizers to mineralize in the soil? How much effect does soil type and texture matter?
How long does it take sugar to dissolve in your coffee? Yeah, for fertilizer like potash, potassium chloride, it's a salt. It'll dissolve immediately. And essentially, as it dissolves, then that portion is essentially mineralized or ready to be taken up. Phosphorus is similarly. Phosphorus fertilizer is either water soluble or citrate soluble, meaning even a weak acid will dissolve it. So those ones are pretty well ready to they're mineralized. Mineralized is something we consider if it's in manure, in organic matter, then you could better sit on the rocking chair and wait for it to happen, because phosphorus and even nitrogen come out of manure fairly slowly.
Yeah. Ryan, I know you wanted to hit on K to M ratio differences by lab. Talk about that.
Yeah, so there's kind of a few things going on in Ontario. We obviously have our accredited soil tests, like we already talked about the Olsen and ammonium acetate, but there's some other things going on. So some labs will report a K to Mag ratio on the lab report. Some labs will use the parts per million of potassium and magnesium for that ratio. Other labs will use the base saturation numbers in that ratio. There's also somewhat differences going on with some micronutrient, the way that's reported. So some labs will report the OMAF accredited index for both manganese and zinc, and then others will just report just parts per million. And then lastly, even the extraction method used for something like zinc does vary by lab in Ontario. So I guess there's the DTPA is one extraction used for zinc, and then there's even the Malic 3 that John had talked about earlier that's used for zinc. So it's important to know what is being reported and what the optimum ranges are for the method that's used, right? So I don't have an issue with either zinc extractant, but for one extractant, if you're under 1 part per million, that's considered low, and if you're under 3 for malic 3, that's considered low. So you just have to know what numbers you're looking at. And then, in terms of base saturation numbers, that's, again, it's not OMAF accredited. Will I look at it? I do somewhat, but kind of like that clip you showed, it's maybe meant for or data that hasn't been studied well in Ontario, right? And from what I see when I do glance at it, oftentimes it tells me the same information that parts per million would tell me. So, or pH. So I'll give an example. Base saturation of calcium, some would argue it should be around 65%. And if you see a 30%, that's considered low. Usually then hydrogen is really high, and you look over and sure enough, pH is low. Another one might be, a different example might be magnesium. Base saturation magnesium is really low. Sometimes you can see that by also looking at the parts per million, which is an accredited sampling method.
So, John, at the very beginning of the program, Peter Johnson asked, what the heck is all over the board behind John? And I saw you pull some stuff off of that board, so I think you're going to show us.
Yeah. If you want to know where this base cation saturation stuff came from, New Jersey. And if you've ever been, I've been to New Jersey, the downer soils predominate the state, very acidic. They grow blueberries on it. The base cation saturation philosophy was figured out as a way, and darn it all they needed to do was lime the acid soils. And then you go to another state, this is Missouri, the Menfro is their state soil, and by the way, it's not glaciated. It's a whole lot different than what we have. They have magnesium deficiencies, and it was one of their scientists that worked on the base cation saturation. These are old rusted out soils. They're not at all relevant to what we're dealing with. And so we just see it as very much of a distraction to our growers. I don't know what value it offers. If you want to sell more potash fertilizer, it's a transfer payment to Saskatchewan. But yes, if you want to use more potassium, just say you're going to use a higher critical level. Don't disguise it with some other philosophies that are not really based on the young glaciated soils we're dealing with in Western Canada or Ontario for that matter.
Cool. I got another question here. John, I'll ask you it. What's the incidence of soil pH changing at depth of ammonium nitrate application across the prairies? I've seen pretty firm evidence of this in Saskatchewan, eventually affecting nutrient uptake.
Well, they don't let us play with ammonium nitrate here anymore in Manitoba. I expect, though, that we're talking about urea. And Laura, just south of you in Montana, they've identified quite a bit of acidification of soils, but it's because, darn all the guys down there are still broadcasting fertilizer. They broadcast urea on the surface, and in some, these are the zero tillers or no tillers, and they're starting to do more acidification of the soil. Most of our nitrogen is in soil banded, and we're not seeing the same evidence of that. So if it's Saskatchewan, if you're looking for where the good intel on this is, it's with our friend Clayne Jones out of Montana State University. Does it affect nutrient uptake? Well, we are seeing some acid soils here in Manitoba, and it's kind of funny. Our canary in the mine shaft, we start to see manganese and aluminum toxicity in canola. So that is one of the first crops where we're starting to see the impact of acidification, and it's not affecting, well, yes, it greatly increases the uptake of manganese and aluminum, which are toxic.
Yeah. Well, earlier we got a little bit of time, just a little bit of time left. I want to try to squeeze in our last clip, which is, and John referred to this. It was the sexing up of the soil textbook with web application. Omafra put together this website. This is Jake Monroe from Omafra, and let's quickly watch this last clip. Here it is.
Hey, we're going to talk soil tests today and how growers can use the new Soil Test Manager app from the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association to better understand soil test information. And Jake, a new app sounds like a great idea. Talk about what's there, I guess, Jake. I mean, like, fertilizer recommendations, best management practices, just demystifying soil tests sometimes.
The Soil Test Manager app that is hosted by Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association is really focused on providing not only the recommendations, but the explanation behind those numbers.
Good stuff, Jake. Hey, why don't you pull it up on your screen and take us for a test drive?
Okay, so we're on the Soil Test Manager website. The important thing to note is that Soil Test Manager is a web-based app. In other words, it's a website that you go to and then you can pin it to your homepage on your smartphone or on your iPad. It's not a traditional app in the sense that you don't go to the Apple Store to download it. So you just go to the website and then you're able to use it as an app. So here we're on the homepage, and the first thing to note is that we've got a Know Your Soil Test tab. I'd recommend starting at the Know Your Soil Test tab and just taking a quick look. This is the overview. This provides some basic information on any kind of soil test result that you'd get back. Nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium are accredited soil tests. And you can see here that there's some basic information that we provide on each of those analyses. pH as well has some background information, tells you a little bit about liming, what buffer pH means, and how we can address magnesium, for example, if magnesium is an issue with low pH as well. Once you've taken a spin through the Know Your Soil Test tab, go back to the calculator and start playing around with it. So here we've got corn selected, but as you can see, you could select from any number of field crops, and we've got the whole list here. If you're a vegetable grower, we've also got a complete list of vegetable crops that you can choose from that's quite comprehensive. So in this example, we're going to select corn. We've got our example field, and I've entered my email. And here we've got a set of soil test results that have been entered. So soil test results that really aren't all that different from ones that I see all the time. We're kind of on the lower end for phosphorus, and we're certainly down below 100 for potassium. So we've got a soil that has some nutrients that need to be addressed. We've also, in this case, have entered a soil pH that's down below 6. So we've got a soil pH of 5.8, and we're going to have a buffer pH with that. That should show up on your soil test. And so we've entered those two values, and then we're going to select a target pH of 7. Now we're going to click Get Results, and here we can see that we've got our full set of results for P and K. There's no recommendation in this case for magnesium, but we do have a liming recommendation of 6 tons per hectare. A good feature about Soil Test Manager is that you can switch from metric to imperial. So here I'm going to click Get Results, and now I've got my recommendations in imperial. Once you've got those results and you've taken a look through them, and again, you can click on the info button for a little bit more information. Click the email results button, and that's going to result in an email being sent to you automatically, and that will be in PDF format. So the Soil Test Manager app provides lots of opportunities to play around with different crops, but ultimately it's a snapshot and it's a single soil test result at a time. So it's meant to be a quick tool to use to get a second opinion or to just confirm the recommendation you've been given. The next feature, and a feature that we're really proud of, both Omafra and Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, is the 4R tool. And here you can see we've got a 4R tool for both phosphorus and nitrogen. And I'll take a quick spin through the phosphorus tool. Here in this case, we're going to use a granular product. We're going to select the timing. So in this case, we're going to say that we're applying that phosphorus at planting, and we're applying it as either an in-furrow or banded application. I'm going to submit that, and I'm going to get a rating out of 4. So here with this scenario, we've got a 4-star rating. We've got phosphorus being applied at planting in a band, and that's considered a really good 4R practice. We've also got a little bit of information that goes along with it. On the other hand, if an application had been made in the non-growing season, say in October or November, and it had been broadcast without incorporation, if I submit that result, we're going to get a 1-star rating. And so in this case, we're going to get a little bit of information to go with that, and we're being told that the risk of loss through runoff and tile drains is high. So it just provides the user a bit of information to help guide decisions around nutrient application, specifically around the timing and application method. Same goes for nitrogen. You can select a product. In this case, I'll select urea. I'm going to select pre-plant timing. And in this case, we're going to incorporate that material. And we've got a good rating, a decent rating of 2.5 out of 4 stars. And again, we can click on the info button for more information on that. If we don't incorporate that urea pre-plant, however, and again, we're talking about a corn application here, we're going to get a 1 out of 4 star rating. And I think many people would agree that a pre-plant application without any stabilizer, not incorporated, is not a good practice, and that's reflected in the rating for our 4R rating in this situation.
Cool stuff. I think a website like that is exactly for people like me. Very, very easy to use. Drop-down menus.
I love it. Those Ontario people finally figured out how to get rid of the damn metric, and now they know to convert to imperial. It's great. I have a slide rule to do that.
But in all seriousness, though, Ryan, that's a pretty useful tool if you're looking at trying to demystify some of your findings, and at the same time get a rating on some of your methods and how that relates to 4R.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one thing I forgot to mention earlier, which that tool shows, is the rating system for things like phosphorus and potassium. So in that tool, the rating of NR or LR, what that means. So for those that aren't familiar with those letters, right? So it's no response, rare response, low response, medium response, or highly responsive to fertilizer, which that tool shows you and just pulls out of those tables and charts that rather than looking up in a book, you can see it all within that tool. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
As we go through all this information, we have tests that you have to pay attention to what tests you're using, because the results can be varied based on soil type and where you are. You got a situation where there is a lot of data on the test, trying to figure out how everything interrelates based on the conditions that are in front of us. It's like taking baseball sabermetrics to a whole new level, trying to, like, when we talk about interpreting soil test results, it sounds just like it just sort of slides off the tongue and it's super easy and it's whatever. But John, it is much more complicated, especially after I spend this last hour and 10 minutes with you guys. It's a lot more complicated than maybe it's given credit for. In order to make the right decision, like, you can make a decision, but we're trying to make the right decision on the fertility choices.
It's okay for things to be tough. I love what Les Henry out here says. Sometimes we have to use the microprocessor, the one between our ears, and this is what people invest with in working with a trusted agronomist like Ryan or others. People will have agronomists that they've worked with. Soil test should not be a single year snapshot. It should be put together over the long term to make sure that the trends, the soil fertility values, are moving in the right direction. For a fellow who may be retiring, like my dad, the right direction for a retiring farmer is to withdraw your fertility levels. And so you work with different farmers with different criteria and with that soil test to allow you to know which direction you should be moving. But I think that it's something that as a farmer you invest in some courses and training, or you have a trusted agronomist you work with on this.
Yeah. Well, and let's wrap up there, Ryan. You know, you're an agronomist. What questions should farmers, when they have that soil test result, what questions should farmers be asking their agronomist?
Yeah, great question. I guess it starts with don't be afraid to ask the question of what are these recommendations based off of, and how did you come up with this recommendation, right? And the agronomist should quickly be able to explain how much build is built into this, and why did you recommend no fertilizer here and have this 300 pounds of fertilizer over here. So it's not a secret. It's not a secret sauce or something like that. It should be explained. We know what our crop removal numbers are, right? And you're really doing two things. You're either following just strictly the sufficiency approach, right, and looking at economics in the short term, or you're maintaining levels or you're building levels, right? So it doesn't hurt to ask the questions of what are these recommendations based off of, and why are you telling me to spend this, $200,000? So
yeah, John, any final thoughts?
Yes, and we're going to kick over that apple cart. These hallowed crop removal values, for us out here, they're greatly out of date. They're pre-1990, pre-hybrid canola, and so we've got a project underway with Fran Wally at University of Saskatchewan. We're revamping or going to look at what are actual nutrient removal values. We know that for our sampling of canola, it's about 70% of what it used to be, and removal per bushel from P and K are lower for corn now than they were 30 years ago. Several of our crops, we need to revamp those values. So, so we'll stay tuned. We may be making changes out here based on some updated numbers of crop removal values.
Yeah, it makes sense to keep all that up to date, right? Especially as, hybrids take on new traits and characteristics.
Yeah. At least once a generation, we should update those.
John, do you think there's a lot of variability in that sort of data as well, or not?
No,
Crop
it seems to be,
numbers? No.
Seems to be rather consistent. Others have been seeing this with corn. Well, those that have been bothering to measure it. Illinois has just revamped theirs. Minnesota, and just find that the new hybrids of corn, the geneticists have all been telling us they're more efficient, but I think it's our production system also. But we've gone from like 100 bushel corn crop removing 45 pounds of phosphate, now looking like it's closer to 35 or 30 pounds of phosphate per 100 bushels. So that can make a pretty big impact if we're basing part of our fertilization strategy on removal amounts.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Hey, guys, great stuff tonight. Hour and 15 minutes. It goes by so fast. I learned a lot tonight. I really do appreciate it. Ryan Benjamins of Benjamin's Agronomy out of Ontario. Hey, Ryan, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Sean.
Nice meeting you, Ryan.
And Mr. Hurd, it was great to see you again. Thank you very, very much. And as always, it was very informative, and look forward to our next chat.
Good stuff. Thank you.
And enjoy that ice fishing tomorrow, too, by the way.
I'll tend to stay on the right side of the ice.
That's a good plan. That's a good plan for sure. I want to thank everybody in the audience for tuning in tonight and for participating with your questions and comments. Remember, tomorrow, go to realagriculture.com/agronomists, and you can be sure to qualify for your CCA credits. You can also watch past episodes as well. We have done some great ones on things like soil compaction, manure management, and a whole bunch of others as well. We'll be back here next Monday night, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 o'clock Mountain, and be sure to tune in this week to Real Ag Live at 3 p.m. Eastern on this same live stream. As well, of course, Real Ag Radio, 4:30 Eastern, 2:30 Mountain on Rural Radio 147. We will be podcasting this episode of The Agronomists if you want to listen to the audio as well. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with The Agronomists. Have a great night. Go Canada and the World Juniors.